Evening, ladies and gentlemen. We are 5 minutes behind schedule. If you don't mind settling down, we can start. Well, this session has been titled India's Strategic Posture and Possibilities for Partnership with Key Liberal Democracies. The panel has been invited to explore how India is likely to and should navigate the dual imperatives of enhancing its economic integration with Asia, both to its east and west in Asia, and strengthening its political partnerships with powers to its west, including the United States and Europe. The panelists have been invited to consider India's role in maintaining a liberal order in Asia and the prospects of engagement with fellow democracies. This theme draws attention to two important, seemingly contradictory strands in Indian foreign policy in the post-Cold War period. First, India's increasing economic integration with emerging economies, both in Asia and in the developing world as a whole. And second, India's growing strategic engagement with democratic nations, both in Asia and outside. Is the geoeconomics of India's globalization in step or out of step with the geopolitics of India's national security concerns? Have Asian geoeconomics drawn India closer to countries in East and West Asia that are not necessarily democracies, while Asian geopolitics require India to build stronger and closer strategic partnerships with other democracies? While the pursuit of economic development at home has defined Indian foreign policy priorities in recent decades, India has also placed emphasis on the strengthening of democracy in Asia as an element in the creation of a global environment conducive to her own economic development and national security. In fact, in September 2014, addressing the United Nations General Assembly, Prime Minister Narendra Modi drew attention to what he termed, and I quote, "a surge of democracy across the world," unquote, welcoming the fact that every country in South Asia, from Afghanistan to Myanmar, from Nepal to Sri Lanka, had renewed its faith in democracy. Indeed, with the exception of China to our east and the kingdoms of West Asia to our west, India is now surrounded from Iran to Indonesia by liberal democracies. Given the challenge posed by the rise of extremism, radicalism, and terrorism in Asia, and the changing balance of power in Asia and around the world, India would have to place equal emphasis on her own economic development and her economic engagement with the rising and emerging economies of the world, including China, and secure a multilateral system that respects the rule of law. Striking a balance between the imperatives of the new geoeconomics of a globalizing India and the new geopolitics of a changing world order in which the rule of law rather than the assertion of conventional or non-conventional power has to be maintained would remain a challenge for Indian diplomacy. India seeks closer economic relations with her neighbors, with developed economies and emerging markets. At the same time, India seeks a world order in which the rule of law prevails and multilateral institutions become more representative of the existing world order. While the 21st century may well be an Asian century, it will have to be a century in which all nations respect the democratic aspirations of their own people, and both governance at home and in international institutions should be conducted within the framework of such representation. How would these considerations come to define India's strategic posture and its foreign policy? In which countries around the world would these Indian concerns and priorities find resonance? Who would be India's partners in shaping a new world order which is more democratic, and egalitarian? These are some of the questions that I posed to my panel. I invited them to reflect on these observations, and I said that they will have 5 to 6 minutes each, so that at the end of their initial statements, we would have enough time for questions from the audience. I have with me 6 very distinguished speakers: Mr. Geoffrey van Orden, a member of the European Parliament; Mr. Michael Clark, former Director General of the Royal United Services Institute in the UK; Mr. David Malone, a rector of the United Nations University in Japan; Mr. Yossi Amrani, the head of policy planning in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Israel; Mr. Steve Blockmans, who is the head of the Center for European Policy Studies in Belgium; and Dr. Tanvi Madan, a fellow at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. We will go in this order, 5 to 6 minutes each. I request each of them to stick to the time, and when the time is up, I will remind them that they have to stop and move on to the next speaker. So let me invite now Mr. Geoffrey van Orden to set the ball rolling.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. May I first of all thank the Ministry of External Affairs and ORF for the invitation to participate in this very excellent conference, which I found most rewarding and stimulating. From a Western perspective, the world, I think, looks in a pretty bad shape. Robert Kagan has observed that we live in a time when democratic nations are in retreat and when democracy itself is also in retreat. It seems that the traditional guardians of the international order lack possibly the capability, perhaps the self-confidence to shape the world in which they had done before. What I would say, though, is that the times we live in and the future are perhaps no more ungoverned than the past. If we look back over events in the last 30 or 40 years, in spite of enormous investment in intelligence agencies, in diplomatic services, and in very excellent think tanks, we've been peculiarly bad at being able to predict some of the great seismic events that have taken place. And I think of the fall of the Berlin Wall, I think of the Iranian revolution, I think of the so-called Arab Spring, and indeed the catastrophic refugee crisis, which is now overwhelming the chancelleries of Europe. The fact is that we can't really predict with any confidence how the world's going to be in 2 years' time or 5 years' time, let alone the 10 years' time on which so many strategic planners try and base their calculations. I wonder, and I pose the question really, does the view of the world from Delhi look the same as it does from Washington or Brussels or indeed London? I'm here in India at a time, I think, when India is seeking strategic definition. There she is as this new great Asian economic power, fastest growing power in Asia, the fifth or possibly fourth largest military power in the world. India is looking for her role, and I think trying to find new ways. We've heard a lot about looking east and indeed acting east. But I just want to pause for a moment and think about thinking and acting west as well. Certainly, I feel that I'm in India at a time when we have a more muscular India, a less risk-averse India, a more self-confident India, perhaps under this Modi government. And an India that, because of that self-confidence, that's open to wider partnerships. if we look at the Western relationships, obviously preeminent among those has to be the United States, for all the obvious reasons which you understand. I mean, there was a period of difficulty, and now there is a very robust relationship, I think both at official levels, but in public attitudes to the United States in India. Not surprisingly, India carries out more naval exercises with the United States than with any other country. But I want to say a word or two about that other relationship, which is the United Kingdom. After all, India and the United Kingdom for centuries have had a largely benign, symbiotic relationship. And many of us would like to think that that relationship is one that can be rekindled and strengthened. I want to say a word or two just to put the UK in perspective at the moment, because of course, as you will be aware, we're going through this great debate at home about our membership of the European Union. This is very difficult. Many are very divided in their views. Many feel in their hearts they want to leave, but they know there are good reasons in their heads why they shouldn't rush for the exit door. I would say that as far as the United Kingdom is concerned, and I was very fortunate, I had a conversation with the British Prime Minister just before I left for India on Monday. He's quite clear that the United Kingdom has a distinct and enhancing role in the international arena in the years ahead. This is a role quite separate from and distinct from our membership of the European Union, which after all is one of many, a rather unique set of relationships and memberships that the UK has. If we look at her leading role in the United Nations, in the Commonwealth, in NATO, in the G7, in the G20, and in many other organizations. And I would say more, that we are now investing more once again in our military and in our other international capabilities, in our soft power capabilities. But bear in mind that from 2020 onwards, we will again have the ability to deploy a carrier task group east of Suez. And I think that India should be looking for strong partnerships once more with a country like the United Kingdom. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Orden. Michael Clark.
Chairman, thank you very much. I wanted to take up a point that the Chairman raised, and which Geoffrey Van Orden just raised now, about the question of whether India is in step or out of step with the Western democratic world and so on. And India is the biggest democracy in the world, and it comes to this juncture in its strategic policy at a time when, as Geoffrey said, Western liberal democracy is under greater pressure than most of us can ever remember. And that's quite important to our strategic relationships and our problems of leadership. The Bertelsmann Foundation produced its Transformation Index for 2016 this week, and it brings it out every 2 years. It looks at 129 transitional and or developing countries, and the news isn't very good. 50% of the sample were suffering worse internal antagonisms than 2 years ago. 63 states out of the 129 have significant religious antagonisms. 50% of the sample were seriously defective in human rights terms, according to Bertelsmann, and a third of the sample were worse at handling all of their various antagonisms than they were a couple of years ago. Whilst that has been taking place, Western democracies, those democracies that we used to feel very secure about in Western Europe and the United States and so on, North America, are suffering greater fragmentation than ever before. Headline figure in Western Europe is that the major political parties traditionally soaked up 80 or 85% of the vote in elections. Now they soak up 65% of the vote, and that is falling. So there are more fringe parties which are more influential in politics. The United States, for different reasons, is more polarized than ever before, and that has fragmentational tendencies as well. There is an ideological malaise in the Western world that our politics have become mere managerialism. They don't stand for any particular ideology because we've lost some of our confidence in liberal democracy since the end of the Cold War, rather surprisingly. And the economic crisis of 2008 has actually dealt a serious confidence blow at the ability of Western liberal societies to manage their economic relationship properly. So there has been a leadership deficit. We said at the end of the Cold War in the Western world that there was a sort of virtuous triangle, that there would be societies around the world that we wanted to see that were democratic, stable, and friendly to the West. Democratic, stable, and friendly. Well, it turns out that in large parts of the world, you can't have all three. You could have one, maybe you can have two of those three things, but you can't have all three. You can perm any two from three, you can have that, but you cannot have all three, certainly not in the Middle East, and not in large parts of Africa. And so the situation is not particularly favorable as we look at it now, but I think it's important to understand that there's some recalibration been going on. I think the Western world understands that what is more important than the formal expression of democracy is legitimacy. Societies need to be legitimate in order to create stability. Governments need to be legitimate, and that will vary from place to place and culture to culture. And we talk a lot, as we've spoken in this conference, about the interest we have in a rules-based international order. And that rules-based, to create and maintain a rules-based international order, I think is the real challenge of managed change that we face in the coming era. And there are three particular domains in which the rules-based international order is most important. And those domains have all been mentioned in this conference, and I would simply emphasize them here. Space, cyberspace, and undersea, underwater. Those three domains are essentially ungoverned. There is no obvious political borders in those domains. They're not naturally part of the state international system. So space, cyber, and undersea are the three borderless domains. And so from Western Europe's point of view, when we think about West European-Indian relations, I think there are two particular strategic interests that arise from this analysis that I've headlined. And they all amount to connectivity. One is indirect and one is direct. The indirect relationship is the importance that I think West Europeans ought to attach to India's role in helping to develop and maintain rules-based approaches to the new international institutional architecture that is arising. We've spoken in this conference, we've mentioned many of the elements of it, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which has a balance sheet bigger than the World Bank, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization that India has joined, the Eurasian Economic Union, the RCEP in ASEAN, and the United States, the TIP and the TTIP. There are lots of them. We've mentioned in the last 24 hours many, many organizations, and it's clear that there is a new structure of international institutional architecture arising. Now, I'm not talking here about the ways in which those structures should be constituted. I'm talking about the rules that will govern them. And the maintenance of liberal values in those structures will be very important. And the most important structures of all, I think, are the ones that haven't yet arisen in the cyber domain. At the moment, cyberspace is becoming balkanized, and that really is a problem. So that's the indirect one. And the direct one, just to give you the headline, is the relationship between India and China at a strategic level. So far, as Europeans see it, does not have a framework. It hasn't settled into a pattern. When it settles into a pattern, I think the Europeans in particular will be able to look at Asian policy without being fixated on China's economic potential. The Europeans are not very good these days at thinking about China in broader strategic terms. And the essence of understanding that will be the India-China relationship, because that will focus the future. We must all avoid introspection and look outwards, and that is the theme of connectivity, which I'm very happy to contribute to in this meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Clark. Mr. David Malone.
Thank you very much, Sanjaya, and warm appreciation to the Foreign Secretary who willed this meeting to happen, and to ORF for pulling it off brilliantly. Very interesting panels and consequently interesting people in the room. I'm not speaking for the UN merely as an occasional student of Indian foreign policy. One thing that I think has been underplayed in a way so far, but not intentionally, has been the role of economic factors in the shift in international perceptions of India. After India's economic reforms, which it backed into in a way in the early 1990s, the American private sector started to see India as a great opportunity. And that was the beginning of a major shift. So economic factors were fundamental in that, and they remain fundamental for India's future, what it can do geostrategically, and how much of its potential, some of it already realized, some of it not yet realized, it's actually going to be able to get round to developing. India's really well positioned globally. It has very few adversaries. It has excellent professionals, as we know, in the private sector, in the arts, in government. It's very much admired throughout much of the world for democracy, as both the previous speakers said. But like Brazil, another continent-scaled country, it tends to introspect rather a lot because there are large electorates in both countries. And for governments dealing with large, diverse electorates with diverse interests, the international scene can fade very quickly. And we've seen that happen often in India. So on the one hand, keeping focused on an economic policy framework that causes the country to continue growing very strongly, and on the other hand, as Michael was saying, remaining focused internationally are two critical challenges for India, as for, I would argue, Brazil. Brazil is not like India in one respect. Brazil is overwhelmingly the largest power of the Americas, other than the United States and certainly of Latin America. India shares space with two other powers in Asia, and perhaps one more coming up behind them. China, obviously, rising very fast. Japan, economically very successful, and indeed the model in many ways followed by Korea, China, Taiwan, and other Asian tigers, and perhaps Indonesia coming up. And how these powers arrange their relationships amongst them is more complex than I think it sometimes sounds. For example, the political relationship between Japan and India is very warm. It was something Prime Minister Singh worked on hard with his Indian counterparts. It's something on which Mr. Modi has worked very hard with Prime Minister Abe. But the economic relationship is frankly dwarfed by the good sentiments, as the French would say. There's very little economic content to the relationship. And that, again, demonstrates the scale of the challenge in Asia to build substance into rhetoric when it comes to regional relationships. The China-US rivalry is a big story, of course, everywhere in the world. But consequently, nobody much notices when China and the US cooperate with each other on something, as they are currently doing on North Korea. I'm also a student of the UN Security Council, and there tends to be a caricature of China as a rising power, breaking a lot of crockery. But actually, it's a rather accomplished diplomatic actor, and consider it otherwise, and only as a possibly expansionist, arriviste power, I think would be a great mistake. Now, what any regional hegemon wannabe or dominant power wannabe runs into is resistance from others. And I'll give you just one illustration of that, which is the United States in Latin America. In spite of the Monroe Doctrine asserted very early, obviously, in the independent history of the US, actually, the United States never subdued the desire of Latin America to maintain autonomy. And Latin America has been able to maintain, and individual Latin American countries have been able to maintain autonomy. And I dare say Asian powers and countries will retain a degree of autonomy also. If one thinks of Myanmar, why did the government of Myanmar shift so suddenly and convincingly, in a way, its orientation? It may have been because it felt one particular foreign power was beginning to occupy too much space within its own destiny, and it wanted to open up its own destiny to its own designs and to other partners. Sanjaya, thank you very much.
Oh, you have 1 more minute if you'd like to use it.
No, that's fine.
Our next speaker is from Israel, Mr. Yossi Amrani.
Thank you very much, Mr. Barrow. It's a great opportunity to be here. I'd like to join my colleagues in thanking the organizers. Listening to some of the discussions here today and elsewhere, there is a certain lingo in conference such as ours here. The theme of this conference is about connectivity, but there is a certain terminology, vocabulary which is coming all the time. New World Order, out-of-the-box thinking, globalization. And one should give much credit to the concept and philosophy of globalization. But at the same time, we should remind ourselves of another G word, which is important to any strategic discussion. And basically, this discussion today is about strategy, the strategy of India into the future. And it's geopolitics. And this concept of geopolitics would shed a light on issues of national security, foreign policy, strategy. This would be true in the case of India. This would be true in the case of other countries, Israel, for example. It is true, as the famous quote of Lord Palmerston, which I found somewhere earlier, that there are neither permanent friend nor permanent enemies, just permanent interest. I would rather say that the global era, with its benefits, challenges, and threats, introduced at least new, if not some changing interest. Honestly, I'm quite honored to be here in this important gathering and in discussing the future of strategic posture of India, as I come from a country which is not as big as India, not as populated as India, and we are not the ninth economy in the world. But rather than that, every country is looking for its own position, its own relation, and its own partnership. And this concept here today is about partnership between countries and how you benefit one another. The main important aspect, though, is the relevance of cooperation, partnership between countries, and identification of a common agenda. Israel-India relations, which will mark its 25th anniversary next year, have seen many periods. Now we are at a peak, at a certain surge in relations and certain developing of new horizon. And the potential is still yet there to be exhausted and built on. The scope of cooperation runs from agriculture, science, technology, and strategic and counterterrorism. Foreign policy, just a second, is a tool in achieving national security. I would dare and say that both countries' interests are served by this cooperation. Israel's foreign policy is based on the following principles, which may be true for other countries as well, maybe even for India. Maintain its national character, a constructive partner in its region, force of stability in one's own region, respected and contributing member of the international community, and of course, the moral, ethical value of foreign policy to the degree that it can be implemented. Much has been said about balance and rebalancing. Our foreign policy, Israel's foreign policy, is aimed at expanding cooperation, diversifying alliances, promoting a better world, a safer and stable region. India is a partner, even in achieving such stability in the Middle East. As the world goes global, as geopolitics remain key to nations' interest and future, it's obvious that my neighbor is my own neighbor. And my national security, everyone's national security, is served by such relations even with far ahead neighbors. Much has been said in recent years about US pivot to Asia. It was already in 1904 that Halford Mackinder, in his famous book, wrote about Eurasia as pivot area. Nothing has been invented. As Asia is a home to most of humanity, a birthplace of several religions and culture, it is time to balance the pivot to Asia with an Asian pivot to Europe and the Middle East. The future of stability, at least in the Middle East, depends on closer relations between Asian countries. India is first and foremost, and regional partners in the Middle East. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Armani. I now invite Mr. Stephen Blockmans to make his remarks.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you also to the organizers for inviting me to this prestigious conference. I wish it well for the future. I would like to talk a little bit more about the perceptions of liberal democracies in the West about India's strategic posture, which does no longer define in a singular aspect, I think, but is more reminiscent of the various positions exercised through yoga. India is not seen as no longer seen as a non-aligned state, but very much one that has sought its alignment in a multi-pronged format. And that makes it difficult to get a grasp on where India really stands, what it stands for. And in fact, I think this protrudes also in an ongoing strategic assessment which the European Union is currently engaged in. On the one hand, one could see India professing an adherence to the principles of respect for democracy, human rights, fundamental freedoms. On the other hand, it seems to be pursuing a more hard-nosed, geoeconomic, pragmatic approach. Of course, this results in a series of relationships in various configurations, some overlapping, some not, with a variety of countries for different purposes. The BRICS, of course, for economic purposes, which Samir Saran last week in Brussels described as no more than a sort of partnership with benefits, which triggered the question, yeah, but where are the children and are they actually growing up? Also basic in a more environmental sphere, IBSA, an emergent partnership amongst three countries which, in the words of Prime Minister Singh, espouse the principles of pluralism, democracy, tolerance, and multiculturalism. And these formats seem to have tensions among one another, especially when seen from the perspective of liberal democracies in the West, which see initiatives like the BRICS as attempts to compete with status quo powers, perhaps. However, I think it will spur over time a development also within Western democracies towards a reform of global governance institutions. Now, this multi-pronged approach serves, of course, a variety of purposes, not least to respond to transnational challenges. Terrorism, India's own 26/11, the attacks on Mumbai, countering piracy, organized crime, pandemics, or securing the maritime realm, or indeed cyberspace, as has been mentioned. And it serves also to move India from being a rule taker to be a rule maker. Now, in the West, I think this strategic posture is not seen as strategic policy so far. And whilst, as I mentioned, reform of the global governance institutions may be pushed in this sense, India and Indian foreign policy makers should be wary of those partners in reform that pursue less of a liberal values-based and less of a rule of law-based agenda, such as, for example, the Eurasian Economic Union, as has been mentioned in a different sense. Now, arguably, a more equitable global governance rests on the premise of more democracy, both at the global and at the domestic level. And with power comes responsibility, and a rules-based approach to connectivity is, I think, one that has already been stressed by this panel. So to conclude, economics, geoeconomics, and geopolitics do not necessarily march in step, as the chair alluded to in his questions, but we must consider them both separately and together. As the 2012 Nobel Peace Prize laureate, the European Union is currently finding out and learning during the Eurozone crisis and the migration crisis. Thank you.
Thank you. And last but not the least, Tanvi Madan.
Thank you, Sanjay, and thank you to the organizers, the Ministry of External Affairs, and to ORF as well. US and Indian policymakers often start their speeches with noting the fact that the two countries, the world's oldest and largest democracies, though Prime Minister Cameron seemed to argue with that, noting it in his speech on Britain and India when Prime Minister Modi was in Britain. But what I'm going to look at is kind of the limits and possibilities of thinking about the US-India relationship, the partnership in terms of the two countries being democracies. Arguably, democracy has been a key driver from the US perspective for the relationship with India. If you think about the US investment in India over the last two administrations, potentially, or thinking about it since 2000, there have been three key drivers. One has been, there's been a strategic imperative given India's rise, its aspiration to play a larger role on the global stage, its strategic posture, and also its potential as a balancer against China, though it's not officially put that way. The second is, of course, the economic imperative and the potential market, but also a source of skills that India brings to the table. And then there is the values imperative, where it is the idea of India that has been important for some constituencies. The idea that a diverse, developing democracy that could be a partner, and also a visible contrast to China, proof that a democracy, a developing democracy, can also deliver the goods. And this has led to the US and India partnering in one way on democracy promotion, which is the US promoting and supporting India's rise. I realize there continue to be doubters here about this, but this as an approach has now been enshrined in documents and statements and arguably in actions by at least the last two US administrations. And what you've seen is that if India can succeed, it provides a role model that no matter what kind of other democracy promotion activities entail, that it provides a role model for what democracies can do. And to use Trumpian language, since we're all living in a Donald Trump world, together US and India, if India succeeds and the US helps it succeed, can make democracies great again. The second way that the two countries can work together, and in terms of the possibilities, is working together to support both democracies in South and Southeast Asia, since we're talking about Asian connectivity, but also democratizing countries, capacity building, offering viable alternatives. And a third way could be, for example, to work together on regional connectivity projects, not just bilaterally, but potentially trilaterally and regionally. We've already seen, for example, India, Japan, and the US, as part of their official trilat, thinking about what they can do together in this space. Finally, we've heard a lot about kind of ensuring that their rules-based international order continue and that these countries support it together. Sanjay mentioned in his comments to us to talk about kind of the democracies versus relationships with non-democracies. I don't think about the conflict so much in that sense, because I think both countries realize that each of them is going to have relationships with non-democracies, and arguably, if the US interest is in a rising India, whether India's rise comes through economic relationships with a variety of countries, or just with democracies, that's not the point. It is the strengthening of India. I think there's also the point that there are going to be differences, whether it's with India's relationship, for example, with democracies or other non-democracies that the US might not have good relations with, but the two countries will have to deal with these differences as they have in the case of, for example, Iran. and they manage that difference pretty well. The complications I see arise from slightly different sources that are related to the two countries being democracies, but it's not just about that. One is that there do come certain difficulties in dealing with democracies that perhaps dealing with non-democracies don't bring these kind of complications. It means that, for example, and we've seen this in the US-India context, that debates and differences will play out publicly, that negotiations will take place under the gaze of a free press, and domestic politics will have to be negotiated and navigated. And it is time-consuming also to build consensus and constituencies in open societies. The second kind of complication that I see, and I would think of them as gaps in some ways, there are three gaps that we're starting to see, at least three gaps that we're seeing play out, but also where the relationship goes. I think you could say the direction of the US-India relations are kind of determined or one way, but it's the pace and the trajectory of how far this relationship moves between these two democracies moves that will be determined by whether these gaps can be closed. The first is the strategic economic gap. We've seen the US and India's relationship with other democracies, for example, in Asia, move together pretty well on the strategic or security partnership track. We have not seen this to be the case on the economic track, where there continue to be hiccups. They continue to be moving at a much slower pace, both in the bilateral US-India context, but also in the regional one, where we have seen that India is not a part of certain regional trade architecture developments, and the US, for example, is not part of certain regional financial architecture initiatives. TPP, APEC, where India is not a member, the AIIB, where the US and Japan are not members, but India and Australia are. And we have to find a way, the US and India, to get beyond trading barbs about whose protectionism this architecture resulted from, and actually think about how to close these gaps. The other kind of related gaps are what I would call an east-west gap and potentially a north-south one. Where there is a sense and I'll conclude very quickly, that whereas on the east, the US and India are cooperating very closely together, that there is a disconnect in terms of India's west, and you'd say the north-south gap potentially in terms of India's relationship with Russia. Finally, and I think we haven't talked about this enough, we've talked about capabilities, but there is a capacity and bandwidth gap that the two countries will have to deal with. What has been laid out in the last day or today and yesterday evening is a fairly ambitious set of initiatives and goals. But the question is, can the systems in both countries actually keep up with the ambitions and meet the ambitions that the political leadership has laid out?
Thank you, Tanvi. We have 15 minutes, considering we started 5 minutes late, so I've got 17 minutes. I will take some questions from the audience and then invite the panelists to come back and speak. Yes, ma'am. If you don't mind, introduce yourself and ask the question.
I'm Teresa Hitchens. I can't reach the microphone.
You'll have to bend it down, I think.
There you go.
Yeah.
And how do you, is it on? Yeah. Okay, I'm Teresa Hitchens, and I'm a senior research scholar with the Center for International Security Studies at Maryland, at the University of Maryland, and my question is for Michael Clark. You mentioned the three borderless domains, cyberspace and sea, that require now some sort of rules-based architecture, and I wondered if you could speak to how you see India's role in developing those rules-based architectures.
Do you want to take that directly, or just gather a few?
Go ahead.
Yes, no, I mean, potentially very important, particularly in cyber. I mean, you've done work on this yourself. I know that cyberspace is the balkanization of cyberspace is one of the biggest threats to other aspects of international security. I'm less worried about undersea, the undersea domain, but that is certainly coming at us in the future. In space, India is a pretty big player in space. So if I had one wish from a Western European perspective is that India would play a really big role in cyber. But to do that, we've got to start to have that conversation, which I know you've written about, Teresa, that we are not having, because all governments are dealing with this very introspectively, as FBI and Apple are doing, as we're doing in the United Kingdom now with our surveillance bill, which has just been presented to Parliament this week. So there's a tendency to rush for national solutions as the cyber domain has become very powerful, really powerful. And India is one of the actors. China will not be an actor in this in the first flush, but India is one of the actors with the United States that could really make a difference. And so at the moment, it's exhortation to do it on a more global basis. That exhortation's got to work because all the trends are going the other way.
Manish Chand.
Manish Chand, editor, India Rights Network. The ongoing resurgence of India and China as Asian powers, emerging Asian powers, have presented two competitive role models. Someone spoke about role models here, Tanvi spoke about that. One is the exuberantly chaotic but creative democracy of India. On the other hand, you have authoritarian free market model, what is called Beijing consensus. My question is, does the continued ascent of China on the global stage, or more success of China, undermines prospects of democracy and development of democratic consensus across the world? And conversely, a more successful India is good news for democracy in the world. Thank you.
A related question? Yes. Okay, then I'll take a couple of more and then come to the panel. Yes, sir.
I'm Yogen Kumar. I just wanted a little clarity from the panelists because particularly the panelists from UK talked about UK coming back to Suez, the east of Suez area, and also otherwise the other countries which are represented here, or the Western as such. Precisely in what areas do you want India to come with you? I mean, for example, do you want Indian ships to sail in the sort of Persian Gulf region, intervene in the various conflicts going on there? The second issue, as I see that when you talk about India's growing convergence, in the case of the United States, for example, is very clear. And that is that there's a clear divergence.
The question, and then we'll get back to the panel.
No, I think you talked about convergence of interest between India and the Western countries.
Right. So if you can frame your question clearly without a long statement.
No, it's okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, because that was not related to the previous one. So what I will do is to invite David to respond to the earlier question and invite you to respond to this one. David.
It's a very interesting question that can apply to any range of powers. I think nations do change as they develop economically. Why? Because populations become more demanding of their own governments as development occurs. Their own appetites grow, in effect, for various services that governments can provide. So I think determinism is always a temptation, but nearly always misleads us. The future always surprises us. So thinking that because we think we know India today or we know China today, we know exactly where that's going to lead them in 10 years would be a huge mistake, myself. I think both societies are going to develop a lot and change a lot, as other societies have when they're experiencing very rapid internal change, particularly very rapid internal economically driven change, which also makes social development possible.
Would you like to?
Yes. Very quick point on China. I mean, I really don't think that China will fully release her potential until she releases the intellectual freedom of her people. And her intellectual freedom means she's got to move more in the direction of democracy. It might not be the same sort of democracy as we know today, but certainly in that direction. So I think there's a change that must come there. On this whole question of the Indian Ocean and the security of the Indian Ocean, the factors in India's new realism, if you like, I think are threefold. Obviously, her economic growth. Also, the fact that now international trade and investment are so important to India. And thirdly, of course, the impact of international terrorism. For India, then, those three factors demand international stability and security, and indeed freedom of the seas. And these are interests which are shared by the Western nations, and certainly my own country, the United Kingdom. And so we're talking about the possibility of new partnerships that will help enforce that rules-based order.
Well, I'll take one more question from, yes, sir.
Very briefly, what can Asia learn from Europe in the integration process? Thank you.
Well, would you like to take that one on?
It can learn some best practices and prevent worst, as we have experienced them of late. Some of the best practices certainly relate to the functional type of cooperation which has led to a level of integration in the single market of the European Union. Some of the worst experiences that the European Union has lived through in these past years is to construct edifices without buttressing them with the necessary support so as to prevent the type of Eurozone crisis that we have now, or the stress on the Schengen zone.
Are there any remarks that you'd like to make, Tanvi, before we close the session? Or
I was just going to say, I mean, on the question of China's ascent versus India's, I don't think India has to succeed or grow economically at the expense of China. India and the US have both benefited from China's economy, and will continue to do so. And it is a reality that both countries have to deal with. I think it's, we're so used to thinking about Chinese strength. One of the things I think there has to be increasing thinking about, not just kind of amongst the democracies that are represented in this conversation, but a broader conversation about what, in terms of China's economic growth slowdown, will mean for those of us who think about this in the strategic realm as well. And I don't think we've thought, there's some thinking about this in terms of how this affects India's economy, the US economy, the global economy. But what are the strategic implications of this? And I think that's something we really do have to think about, and it hasn't played out. I'll just say one thing. There's a lot of mention of kind of the West and kind of India, or the West versus East. I think when you're thinking about geography, it's fine, but I think philosophically we need to move beyond that concept. I'm not sure that it means, since we're thinking in terms of forward-looking, is China not a Western country for India anymore? Since there's a railway to Iran, and it's with CPEC it'll be in India's West. And as Prime Minister Modi said, isn't the US an Eastern country for India now? He said, when I look east, I see the Western shores of the United States. So I think we do need to think beyond the West versus India.
If I may just make a comment on the European integration one, I think it looks better from afar. It is true to say that the origins of the European Union were noble origins. They were indeed to prevent war in Western Europe, in particular to stop France and Germany scrapping with one another, with all the disastrous consequences that we saw from that. And in that, there's been great success. And that success has been built on economic factors. And the lesson I would say is, don't stray too far from that. Build economic interconnectivity, but don't at the same time undermine national democracy. Don't at the same time be insensitive to national sovereignty. And I think that is the great problem that we see at the moment.
Thank you. David?
A couple of things. ASEAN used to be greatly derided in the West as a talk shop, but actually it turns out that talking can be more useful than not talking. And in that sense, ASEAN has played a very useful role in Asia, not least by eventually grafting onto itself the ASEAN Regional Forum and bringing in a variety of outside interlocutors. So thinking that Western models need to apply necessarily to all parts of the world, huge mistake. But what does need to, I think, apply, and what India has been very kinetic at recently, is moving from sort of non-alignment in the sense of let's keep ourselves distant from as many parties as possible, to something that Raja Mohan actually often describes as sort of multi-directional engagement. India's been very good at that in recent years. And so that's something I'd strongly encourage rather than inward lookingness or just pointless talk shops.
Mr. Amrani, any last thoughts?
No, thank you.
Would you like
Just one very brief word. Europeans are in no position to try and teach policy lessons to a society like India. The contexts are very different. But there is something to be derived from the history of European economic development and integration that was implied in the last question, which is that European societies all made their greatest strides economically when they had internal infrastructure and communications. And that was clear from the 18th century right through to the mid-20th century. It was their own internal connectivity that provided the groundwork for their external prosperity. And a lot of discussion took place, lots of mentions were made this morning of the Marshall Plan. We need a Marshall Plan. Everybody says a Marshall Plan because it was very successful. But remember, the Marshall Plan was actually very small. It was $13 billion even in 1945. Even in 45, that wasn't a great amount of money. But the reason it was so successful is because the infrastructure, despite the Second World War, the infrastructure of those societies meant that they were ready to bounce back. They had everything in place, apart from the physical capacity. So they bounced back. And that's something which I think European history is instructive, not in policy terms, but in historical terms. It's internal connectivity, which allows societies to make the best use of relatively small amounts of external investment, if it arises.
Well, I had one closing thought, but I now have two closing thoughts with which I shall end. My first closing thought derives from what was just said about the European Union. I used to argue with my European friends who would come to India 20 years back and ask us to learn from the EU how to build regional integration. That at the end of the Second World War, both India and Europe launched on the same project, which is to have a common constitution, a common market, a common judiciary, a common army, a common rule of law, common foreign policy, and so on and so on, right? I mean, that was the original project of the Union. We created a nation very similar to the European Union. We are still struggling with it. We still don't have a common market. We still don't have a common tax system. The Parliament has been handling that for the last several months. But we have a common constitution. We have a common foreign policy, which is why we are here today. We have a common defense policy. And when we see the crisis in Europe, I think the time has come for Europe to learn from India now how to reconstruct some of these common frameworks. But my concluding observation is that this session, when we were invited to participate in it and I was asked to chair it, was to consider, I guess, India's strategic posture from the perspective of liberal democracies. And I think the conclusion I draw from all the observations of our distinguished panelists is that the fact of their being from liberal democracies is not a factor. That's not a factor in their consideration of India's strategic posture, indeed of any country's strategic posture. We live in the real world of realpolitik, where money counts, where power counts, and I think many of us in India have kind of fancied ourselves that being a world's largest democracy is a strategic factor in the definition of India's global positioning. I'm not sure that argument has been convincingly defended by our panel. I think we all now look at what India brings to the table: market size, Indian Ocean security, Asian security, is really the world of realpolitik and real power. I don't know if that's a cynical conclusion to come to as the chairperson. I'm not giving the panelists a right to respond to that summing up, but I leave it for you to think about.